Ionescu. She got it.
And Stewart doing it all. That is what makes her special.
Hey Liberty fans, and welcome back to Liberty FM. I'm François, and today we're looking back at what has probably been the toughest stretch for the New York Liberty season so far. After 4 straight losses, questions were starting to pile up. Was this simply a rough patch caused by injuries? Were the Liberty finally being exposed? Was Chris DeMarco losing control of the team? Or was this just a championship team going through adversity? Well, before the All-Star break, the Liberty managed to win 2 straight games against the Dallas Wings and the Chicago Sky. But I'm not ready to say everything is fixed. Far from it. Because yes, they stopped the bleeding. But there's still a lot of wounds that haven't been healed. Today I want to look at what really caused this 4-game losing streak, what changed against Dallas and Chicago, and why I'm encouraged by some things, still worried by others, and finally talk about the biggest mystery surrounding this team right now, Betnijah Laney-Hamilton. So let's get into it. Before we celebrate 2 wins, I think it's important to understand why the Liberty found themselves in this position in the first place. Because yes, injuries matter. Missing Leonie Fibish and Fauthoux Sabali is significant. Those are 2 starters, 2 versatile defenders, and 2 players who fit perfectly into what Chris DeMarco wants to do. But if we're being honest, I don't think injuries explain everything. Some of the issues we've seen during this losing streak have been present all season. The biggest one? This team simply hasn't been able to put together a complete 40 minutes performance. Every game seems to follow the same script. The Liberty look sharp for a quarter, maybe even a half, and everything suddenly falls apart. The offense becomes stagnant, the defense loses its intensity, the rebounding disappears, turnovers pile up, and before you know it, a 5-point lead turns into a double-digit deficit. We saw it against Indiana, and unfortunately, we've seen it too many times this season. What I found encouraging, though, was hearing Breanna Stewart after the Indiana loss. She didn't make excuses. She didn't blame injuries. She looked in the mirror, she said she needed to be better, and that's what leaders do. And honestly, Stewart has been carrying this team for most of the season already, so hearing her taking accountability says a lot about the culture inside our locker room. But leadership alone isn't enough. At some point, execution has to follow, and that brings us to Chris DeMarco. I've tried to be patient with Chris DeMarco this season. He's a first-year head coach. He's dealing with injuries. He's trying to implement a new system. Those are all valid points, but we're almost at the All-Star break now. At some point, experimentation has to become identity. One thing that has really stood out to me is how often the Liberty change lineups, rotations, and defensive schemes. Sometimes they play man-to-man, then a zone, then a full court press, then switching everything, then another starting lineup. Against Dallas, that was already the team's 13th different starting lineup this season, and that's a lot. Now, some of that is because of injuries, but some of it also feels like a coach is still searching for answers. One point that Erica Ayala from the Gotta Get Up podcast made recently really stuck with me. She basically questioned whether the Liberty have the right roster for the style Chris DeMarco wants to play. And that's a fair question. Is the philosophy wrong? Or does the roster simply does not match that philosophy? Because offensively, I actually think the answer is pretty clear. Whenever the Liberty simplify things and let Sabrina Ionescu, Breanna Stewart, and Jonquel Jones play through each other, good things happen. Those 3 are your stars, and they should be the foundation of everything you do. And that's exactly what we finally started to see against Dallas. Let's be clear, this wasn't a perfect basketball game, not even close. Dallas was missing page breakers, the Liberty was still making defensive mistakes, and they still had another disastrous 3rd quarter. So a lot of the same problems were still there. But for the first time in weeks, I actually saw some fight. This team didn't quit. When Dallas made its run in the 3rd quarter, the Liberty answered. When Sabrina couldn't buy a basket, she never stopped shooting. When things got difficult, nobody started pointing fingers. Instead, they stayed together. And that's the biggest difference I saw. And there were a few basketball reasons for that too. The Liberty only committed 6 turnovers. They attacked the offensive glass, they played for Jonquel Jones in the paint, they let Stewie initiate offense, and most importantly, they kept putting the ball in the hands of their best players. And that's not revolutionary, that's championship basketball. It felt much more intentional than some of the previous games. The Stewie and Jonquel 2-player actions look dangerous again. We've been asking for it for years now. The Sabrina and Stewie pick and roll completely changed over time, and that's the identity I like to see moving forward. So the system looked better, the effort was better, the fight was better, but stopping the bleeding still requires someone to close the wound, and that someone was Sabrina Ionescu. Actually, make that two people, because while Sabrina owned overtime, Marine Fauthoux quietly delivered one of her most complete performances since arriving in New York. One player who perfectly embodied that resilience was Sabrina Ionescu. For 40 minutes, this was honestly one of the worst shooting performances of the season. The shots were there, they just wouldn't fall. She was getting clean looks from free, good looks in the mid-range, opportunities at the rim, and nothing seemed to go in. There was a point where she was just 3 for 20 from the field. Normally, that kind of night can completely take a player out of the game mentally, but that's what separates great players from elite players. After the game, Sabrina said something I loved. She said the shots actually felt good. The basketball guys just weren't on her side. She kept believing the next one would go in, and when overtime started, she treated it as a fresh 5-minute game. And that's exactly what happened. She completely flipped the script. 12 points in overtime, perfect shooting. Every big possession seemed to run through her. Whether it was attacking the basket, knocking down the mid-range jumper, or creating off the pick and roll with Brianna Stewart, she suddenly looked like the Sabrina we've become accustomed to seeing. And that's championship mentality, because great shooters don't remember the last miss. They only think about the next shot. And if Sabrina's overtime was the biggest individual story, I would say that Marine Fauthoux might have been the biggest surprise. And this was probably her best game as a member of the New York Liberty. 10 points and 10 rebounds, a double-double off the bench. But honestly, the numbers don't even tell the whole story. She played with confidence. She attacked when opportunities were there. She moved the ball well. She crashed the glass. And most importantly, DeMarco trusted her enough to leave her on the floor for the entire overtime. And that's a huge vote of confidence. Now, does that mean she's completely back after her ACL injury? Not yet. I still think there's another level she'll reach as she gets more comfortable with the pace and physicality of the WNBA. But this game showed exactly why the Liberty signed her. She's a winner. She played in big moments in Europe. She doesn't panic, and against Dallas, that experience really showed. As encouraging as those individual performances were, there was still one storyline hanging over this team that nobody could ignore, and that's Betnijah Laney-Hamilton. At this point, I think it's fair to say that this has become the biggest unanswered question surrounding the Liberty. Another game, another DNP. And honestly, the explanations we've been getting don't really match what we're seeing. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not going to pretend I know exactly what's happening behind the scenes. None of us do. There are several possible explanations. Maybe she's still working her way back physically after missing so much basketball. Maybe the coaching staff doesn't think she's ready yet. Maybe they're managing a workload. Or maybe, and I stress maybe, the organization is protecting an asset ahead of the trade deadline. We simply don't know. But that's exactly the problem. The lack of transparency has created more questions than answers. Because this isn't just another role player. This is Betnijah Laney-Hamilton we're talking about. A player who was an all-star. A player who has been one of the emotional leaders of this franchise. A player who helped bring a championship to New York. Seeing someone with that resume not even step on the floor naturally raises eyebrows. And you could sense the frustration after the game. The media keeps asking about her. The coaching staff keeps giving similar answers. And the players are clearly tired of hearing the same questions. But until there's a clear explanation, I think people are going to keep asking. And honestly, I don't blame them. Fortunately for the Liberty, they didn't have much time to dwell on Dallas. One more game remained before the All-Star break, a home matchup against the Chicago Skies. And in many ways, that game was more important than Dallas. Beating Dallas ended the losing streak. Beating Chicago was about proving it wasn't just an emotional bounce back. On paper, the Liberty were the better team. Chicago has improved throughout the season, but this was still a game New York should win. And for stretches, they looked much more like themselves. The ball movement was cleaner, the offense looked more organized, the stars were playing for each other instead of taking turns. Defensively, there was still room for improvement, but I thought the overall effort was much more consistent than what we've seen during the losing streak. And more importantly, the Liberty didn't allow one bad stretch to completely derail the game. And that's been one of the biggest issues this season. When adversity hits, everything seems to snowball. But against Chicago, they managed those momentum swings much better. And it took a monumental game from Sabrina Ionescu, or should I say, Sabrina, to get the win. 9 points in the last minutes to come back from an 8-point deficit with incredible free-pointers and an N1 play. The Barclays Center got so loud that it brought JJ back to the feelings of winning the title at home in Game 5 of the 2024 WNBA Finals. Now, does 1 week erase all my concerns? Absolutely not. This team still has to prove that it can defend athletic guards consistently as they struggle against players like Sydney Taylor, Kelsey Mitchell, Paige Beckers, or Marina Mabrey. They still need more production from the bench as well, like we've seen lately from Rebecca Allen or Marine Fauthoux. And they still need to establish a clear identity under Chris DeMarco. But going into the All-Star break with 2 consecutive wins feels very different from heading into a 6-game losing streak. Momentum matters, confidence matters, and maybe, just maybe, those 2 wins brought this team the reset it desperately needed. Which brings me to one final thought. So where does that leave the New York Liberty? I think somewhere in the middle. I'm not pressing the panic button anymore, but I'm also not declaring that everything is fixed. The Dallas game showed resilience. The Chicago game showed progress. But progress isn't the same thing as consistency. The biggest lesson from these 2 wins is actually pretty simple. When the Liberty played through Stewie, Sabrina, and JJ, it's still one of the best teams in the WNBA. Those 3 remain the foundation. Everything else should complement them. Now, the All-Star break arrives at a perfect time. It gives Chris DeMarco a chance to reassess. It gives injured players more time to recover. And hopefully, it gives this team an opportunity to establish a clear identity heading into the second half of the season. Because the schedule is not going to get any easier. They start already with a West Coast trip right after the All-Star break. So the margin for error keeps shrinking. And if the Liberty want to win a second championship, the second half of the season has to look very different from the stretch we just witnessed. The bleeding has stopped. Now, the challenge is making sure the wound doesn't reopen. Thank you all so much for listening to another episode of Liberty FM. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and let me know your thoughts. Have the Liberty turned the corner, or do you think these last 2 wins only mask deeper problems? I'd love to hear your perspective. Until next time, take care, and as we always say, let's go Liberty!